So do you realize that in this room, there's like a terabyte of RAM and probably like, I don't know, 128 gigs of VRAM from various cards and terabytes of flash storage? I don't know. We've discovered a lot of interesting stuff, specifically about Adobe Premiere.
If we combine all this hardware, I still can't finish my video render.
But it finished. It's done.
Yeah, it was supposed to be running in the background, and we had to tell it to run again, which has never happened. We've been working on this for 2 different sessions of working together, and that's the first time that's ever happened.
I think AMD might have missed the boat a little bit with this aspect of the Radeon 7 launch, because we're using Radeon 7 for rendering with Premiere with Red Giant plugins. Now, I am just now getting under the hood of Premiere, and by just now, I mean like 3 to 6 months. And I understand After Effects a lot more. I have actually some experience with After Effects from some other projects, but Premiere is not something that I've really messed with under the hood. And Premiere is a very strange program. And you've been having crash problems for like years. Mm-hmm. And you've done a lot of work trying to figure out what the issue is. And I think you're on the right track.
The big thing that if anyone hears me talk about work I've done was in 2017, I produced a 5.5 hour long video about OBS. And that just started me down the deepest, darkest rabbit hole of trying to figure out why videos won't render in Premiere.
So you're saying that if you try to render a 5-hour video in Premiere, it's problematic?
Just a wee bit.
I don't think anybody would have guessed that. Everybody that uses Premiere on a daily basis is laughing real hard right now, so yeah. You should laugh too.
The problem, there's a lot of different aspects that we will have to break down, but there's the modularity of the different codecs and renderers that take place all at once, because it's not just the Premiere renderer. And then there's issues with the plugins that we mentioned, Red Giant, and how its VRAM usage relates to performance with rendering, and the fact that I've gone through, this is our 5th different graphics card we've tried with different amounts of VRAM to actually get something stable. And I'm just crying looking at it actually working for once. This is a test project that I've used for my own benchmarking, trying to figure out where it is. We've brought it over here with multiple different configurations, including the top-end Threadripper CPU.
2990, 128 gigs of RAM.
And this is the first time that we've had a fast and stable render. Because we had it before, I've mentioned in a couple videos now, we've had it with a Vega 64 card using the high bandwidth cache to basically use up all of your RAM as VRAM as well. That worked, but it was very slow. Radeon 7 so far is really fast, and it finished.
And we're not even using HBCC yet.
Oh yeah, that's only the 16 gigs that come on it, which is pretty cool.
So over the last couple of months, we've been putting together a video on how to make Premiere go faster. And ultimately the answer for how to make Premiere go faster was 2 computers.
2 computers.
Neither one of us expected that, because both of us are like, here, hardware, have all of my money. That's not a good strategy.
I for the first time in my life, I'm in a position, both due to contacts and actually making money doing what I do, that I'm in a point where I could actually scale the hardware that I have instead of just trying to use what I have. Except I keep scaling it and the problem keeps persisting, because I started with an AMD FX rig and started running into problems there. Finally got an X99 rig with a 6900K, 10 cores. It's gonna be great. Ran into the problem. Begged and pleaded for my Intel contact to send me my i9 that I have now. Got a little bit better, and then I'm like, all right, now I was questioning if I should go to Threadripper. I'm like, I can just keep climbing the ladder, but we can't solve a software problem with the hardware. It's just...
Well, I mean, you should be able to solve a software problem with hardware, but it doesn't work that way.
It depends on how big the problem is.
On my side, I've been working on the Threadripper 2990. Now, the Threadripper 2990 is 4 chips in one, and on Linux, it works great. But on Windows, it doesn't work great. And on Premiere, the performance was absolutely baffling. The only thing that makes sense about the performance that we observe in Premiere is if you really think of Premiere as a front end for a whole bunch of programs from a whole bunch of different teams. And so, H.264 decoding at 1080p and 4K, those have different performance characteristics. H.265 decoding at 1080p and 4K have different performance characteristics. Red's footage has different performance characteristics, and also depending on the resolution there as well. Lumetri Color has different performance characteristics that have changed dramatically from the 2018 version of Premiere, like the Q2 or Q3 2018 to the 2019 version, but also the Red Giant plugins. I mean, Digital Foundry, I think, recently mentioned in one of their videos when they were testing Radeon 7 that, it's like, don't read too much into it, but some of their rendering issues went away with Radeon 7, and that's something we've been working on for months to try to kind of like figure out.
And then and this fixed it. I'm just like, oh, I went looking for pre-orders for that card right then, because.
So it's not just, I mean, there's more to it than that. So I reached out to my contacts that work in production studios, like Hollywood, TV studios, things like that, because of the software side of things. And it's like, well, you guys use Adobe Premiere and other stuff. I mean, these are companies that have like Avid workstations and really high-end stuff, but you think like TV commercials and, low budget stuff. And I was like, what do you guys do? And the answer was, I'm summarizing here a little bit, was, yeah, Adobe's super crashy. We got all kinds of plugins. If you get too many fonts on the system, we have those kinds of crashes. It was really illuminating. But their general fix was to just make the project smaller. And so because of like the composition system, you can just create short little clips and do whatever you need. So you can pre-render an After Effects clip. Most TV commercials, there's not more than like 3 or 4 seconds of one piece of continuous footage on screen. And so even with 8 gigs of VRAM, you can totally render it. But also, most of their workstations have like NVIDIA Quadros. And so Quadros have more RAM, they're set up for 10-bit color, the drivers are different.
They're validated.
And so I would say that NVIDIA is more interested in taking care of those Premiere customers on like the Quadro side of things than the GeForce side of things, and that maybe creates an opportunity for AMD with these cards.
And that's a big thing, in that a lot of people who maybe don't have those problems as much try to push is like, okay, you're trying to do real work with a gaming card, but there's also a scale of budget, because to get an equivalent like 1080 Ti version of a Quadro to match the rendering performance that I already have, crashes aside, it's like $10,000. So it's, there's a scale of, yeah, I'm trying to do work, but I'm doing this level of work. I'm not doing this level of work. And
we're not working for Walmart.
Yeah.
We're working for YouTube. So it's like, is there like a licensing program for poor people or something? Can
right. Where's my budget Quadro that's still like, where's just give me the gaming card but slightly better?
And all the timing of this is kind of serendipity, because AMD recently announced that they were going to do the Pro support for Radeon 7. Now, that means those drivers are not necessarily certified for truly professional workloads like SolidWorks. So there is still a reason to buy workstation cards, but it seems like AMD is looking at this niche and saying, well, we can support this niche maybe a little better. And I feel like NVIDIA is aware of it too, because like the Titan V, honestly, the pricing for the Titan V for like scientific, academic, and these types of workloads is not bad at $3,000, but $700 is a lot better than $3,000.
No, and that's a big thing. I was very close to buying a Titan when we're going this, and I've said that my action is to buy more hardware, because you think that would work, and theoretically that might help me. 24 gigs of VRAM on a Titan RTX is pretty nice, but it's $2,500. But when you think about it in terms of the Quadro, it's a $5,000 or $6,000 Quadro for the closest to my current performance. Dropping that down to $2,500 is nice, and it's right in between. It's not a Quadro, it's not a Tesla, it's not a scientific card, but it's not a gaming card. And there's a lot of bashing of it for being so expensive when it game's the exact same. But for certain target demographics, it makes a lot of sense. But
10-bit color.
$700 is so much more compelling.
Also 10-bit color? I don't know. We don't know yet.
And it's seemingly just as fast. Like in all the benchmarks so far, and in our own benchmarking so far, it's matching 2080s and stuff. Like, that's not a sacrifice. It's nice.
So I think that the Titan RTX would have to be significantly faster to make that value proposition. If this card holds together and holds stable,
right,
then even if you undervolt it, even if it's 5% slower, it is still dramatically faster than Vega with HBCC. And so the 16 gigs really makes a difference. Now, one of the things we wanted to do was get a cheap Founders Edition card. I never was able to make that happen for a reasonable price, but the 16 gig Founders Edition of Vega probably doesn't require HBCC, although we were seeing VRAM usage of like 24 gig plus when we were rendering these same projects. So either the drivers have been updated, or something about Radeon 7
Right.
is able to run with 16 gigs, where 8 plus 8 on a Vega 64 could not. And if you think about Adobe Premiere as a whole bunch of programs that, like, it's a modular architecture. I mean, even Adobe After Effects, you do stuff in After Effects, and that is a whole different critter when it comes to rendering. You think about how all of that is put together from so many different developers. Really, the best thing that Adobe can do from a leadership standpoint is to provide the third-party developers how-tos and lots of documentation on this is how you deal with NUMA, this is how you deal with massively multi-threaded things, this is how you deal with lots of cores. And maybe that's why Adobe is looking into doing their own hardware for some of this acceleration. All these little nuggets of things happening right now is related to stuff that we've been working on for months, I think. It's just like no one has articulated the grand vision of where we can be with video editing in a few months, because people on iPads having a better experience with 4K editing, that is uncalled for.
Oh, it's so interesting to see. Oh, you start scaling price of processors at the moment, you get to the top end Threadrippers, and we just are the same project that we're rendering right now that's already about halfway done. We've been recording for maybe like 20 minutes. We had running for like an hour and a half to 2 hours on here.
On the 2990.
Yeah, on the 32 thread.
Yeah. And there's no reason it should do that. That's a lot of the threading problems that we've talked about before. But on the 2950 in UMA mode, it comes close. It's pretty close. It's not quite as fast as Intel's top end, but it's pretty close for Premiere and rendering and all the stuff that goes into it. But it's also critical that you have that other hardware so that the full package is not really bottlenecked by any one thing.
Right, because even, especially when we're dealing with the kind of VRAM overloaded issues or graphics card overloaded issues, since so much of the Windows desktop is reliant on GPU acceleration, you overtax your GPU, you can't use your desktop. I can get points where my video isn't frozen in rendering, but my desktop, I literally can't move the cursor. And then what am I supposed to do for work? Am I start carving on stone tablets?
And that's another interesting conversation, because Windows desktop composition stuff has been there since, Windows 7 a little bit, but really Vista is where they started doing like the desktop window manager thing and 3D acceleration. And really that was to leverage the hardware for managing Windows and layering and high resolution devices, because Windows really struggled with like those high resolution devices, and you see the writing on the wall with 4K. And so all of the thread management and process management and stuff is now handled by that DirectX-ish API layer in Windows. It's not really DirectX, but the desktop goes through that as well. And it's not the best at managing load and juggling processes. And that's why, you've got another video coming out, I think, on like Apex and the video capture. And this is all related to that.
And that's why we're seeing, in terms of not being able to scale this to more hardware in one machine, because we're seeing so many different software problems compounding onto each other, all related to the same kind of not being able to use resources efficiently enough. But in terms of the GPU management, basically, one of the things I always push whenever I kind of gently mock people who are still running Windows 7 is Windows 10 in many cases performs significantly better at tasks like gaming and things like that. But it does it with the way they've updated the desktop graphics manager, that it gives all the horsepower it possibly can to the in-focus application that's demanding the most. So when you start trying to stream, which is super intensive on top of gaming, even if you turn off game mode and full screen optimizations, every little setting they can try to give you, your game is like, hey, I need all the juice. And Windows is like, okay, buddy. And OBS is like, hey, we need some over here. And Windows is like, who are you? Bye. You got CPU priority, you got CPU thread affinity. I can manually assign which program goes to which CPU thread and juggle things like crazy. Like I can have a program that uses up 100% CPU, cut it in half, and still assign something else, but I don't have that for the graphics card. And be that in a driver per company, which will rely on varying implementations from AMD or NVIDIA, or on a Windows level, we need something.
We really do.
But for the time being, the solution for streaming, which has been common for a couple years now, and even the solution for video editing for Premiere, you need multiple machines. You need to be able to offload some of the work if you're going to keep working.
Isn't that crazy? That just seems insane. It's like, I have to get another computer because, and it is the fastest, easiest thing with Premiere is to just get a second computer and render. Instead of buying that 2990, you're better off buying two 2950s or, like the 12 core or whatever. It seems crazy, but that's where we are. And Radeon 7 for content creation is the best bang for the buck right now, hands down.
I am eating my words so much because I actually kind of mocked the AMD launch event for AIO snake. I mocked AMD at not publicly, but just in general when they launched the Radeon 7 because they always talk up Radeon cards as being the best for creators, and I've never felt that way because their encoder's not as good as Nvidia's, and they haven't kept up performance-wise, and I've just kind of been like, but they're not though. But I have never so quickly wanted to kind of, start implementing other things into my ecosystem.
AMD's had the hardware, but the software side of it has been a little problematic, I think. And with the new one driver approach and being able to support some of the professional features and this, they're headed in the right direction, but they need the programming talent to follow through. They also need to go on the horn with Adobe and form a really close partnership like they're doing, because on the enterprise side with it's funny you mentioned the encoder, because on the VMware side with the VDI, a lot of the people that are doing those types of workloads complain about the Adobe encoder as well. And that's part of the reason why they're pushing the Citrix Zen desktop partnership with their professional series cards. Mm-hmm. And so that is kind of related to some of the hardware and some of the functionality and kind of misunderstanding, I think, what is needed on that side of things. And so that's a whole other conversation about hardware assist encoders and stuff like that, because the NVINC stuff that is on NVIDIA cards is extremely well done, and it's so well done that they've got to rely on software locks to keep the genie in the bottle, as it were. And AMD is getting there, but they've got to work that much harder to get there and sort of take over, because NVIDIA can fix a lot of this with driver updates, and maybe they will, and maybe the Titan V is a pretty good experience just because of the VRAM, but they've both got work to do, just different kinds of work.
And I have been working behind the scenes, nothing I can publish yet, but directly with some NVIDIA engineers with even these projects we're testing to try to resolve this, because they're convinced that it can be, which is heartening for me, because I don't want them to just be like, go buy a Quadro. As much as that would be a simpler answer and potentially quicker for me, I'd rather know that it's getting fixed on a bigger picture.
Let's go buy a Quadro and make sure your projects are very short.
And still cut up your projects anyway. And so they are literally testing these projects and running debug drivers or whatever. They do a lot of stuff behind the scenes to try to track down why this is happening, and hopefully a partnership could be made. But I agree that Adobe should partner more with AMD. They are very in the NVIDIA Intel camp at the moment, and honestly, all that does is punish Ryzen adopters. That was a big thing, was everyone jumped in and said, hey, Ryzen has so many cores, it's great for editing, and then it was so unstable.
Or people with the 2990.
Yep.
Behind me is a Threadripper 2950X with 64 gigabytes of G-Skill memory. It's the kit that I reviewed a bunch of times now, in every build pretty much.
It's the prettiest kit.
A lot of RGB. But the 2950X, for your particular workflow, rendered faster.
Yep, this has been kind of whiplash, because I went from realizing that I don't need a 2990WX because my i9 is great to a significant decrease in render time on the 2950X. It was 8 minutes of a 40-ish minute render. It was fairly significant, and it's the full same project, no crashes, same Radeon 7, even playback performance, on the actual timeline, you could see when some of the heavy Red Giant effects were in play on my i9, it was still single-digit FPS, which is the problem, but on mine it was 1 to 3 FPS, maybe 4, as it's playing back on the timeline, which is still usable with the Radeon 7 versus what I was using before, but on here it was double that, so we're talking 7 to 8 to 9 FPS playback, which is still smoother, and as you're scrolling through, it's able to catch up with a little lower latency, which I wasn't expecting.
It's also, the crazy thing, though, is that you can't say that the 2950X is actually always faster than the i9. And you can't say that the i9 is always faster than the 2950X, because it depends on the project and the codecs and everything. You can't just say Premiere is faster, because the built-in codecs matter, but the built-in codecs come from third parties.
Right.
The effects matter, but the effects as they apply to different codecs of footage have vastly different performance characteristics. So there's no silver bullet.
Yeah, there's so many different processes going on at once with decoding the footage, applying the effects, re-encoding the footage at the same time, which is something we were doing here, which is a limitation I have with my current workflow, is I have to do just like raw renders and then encode later. But there's so much going on that for more simple projects, you may not need anywhere near this, and there may be no performance increase because it's all way faster than, you know, what you typically need. But at the same time, if you're working with 8K red raw footage or something like that,
it's going to be a different performance.
Yeah, I can't even begin to speculate what the performance would be because that's not in my workflow.
Now you're using a Blackmagic Ursa. I'm using a GH5, so my footage typically comes in as MP4. Sometimes we use all-I. Sometimes we've got an Atomos, and sometimes we use the Atomos ProRes thing. And we've noticed that the performance difference there is all over the place. Not just like the time, like ProRes is great for timeline scrubbing and like quick editing. MP4 varies. It depends on a lot of factors. The 10-bit codec scales better to like the 2950X versus say like a 9700K or a 9900K. So it's like the only people I see on the internet that are really doing comprehensive testing is like Puget Systems. So they've got like the write-ups and stuff like that. And they're like, here's the source footage, here's the project, here's what we did. And that's pretty much what everybody who's benchmarking Premiere is gonna have to do, because it's so modular and the performance varies so dramatically that there's not one silver bullet. But this, for a $1,000 processor and a $700 graphics card, this is insanely good. So yeah, this system, Radeon 7 fixes the complaints that we had with Vega for content production, which is what delayed the release of some of those videos. But if you see a good deal on Vega and your projects are not super complicated, with the HBCC, probably not bad. Really, like heat, managing the heat was the worst thing with Vega, so underclock on that. But Radeon 7 seems to be doing a much better job of that. So good job.
Much quieter too.
But let us know what you think. If you have any questions, follow-up video. You're doing the video on Apex Gaming and like the GPU overhead with that, and so it's going to be a continuation of this conversation. And if you haven't seen the what's the fastest way to make Premiere faster to PCs, you should check that video out as well.
Thanks for watching.
See ya.